Hi everyone, Claire here and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to be sharing my process of how I created this African wild dog painted in acrylic. This video will be a time-lapse video where I share my process for creating that intense gaze, the rich colours and intricate fur details. I'll walk you through the colour mixing, the paints and brushes I used and the overall process for bringing this painting to life. So once that I have my initial sketch in place, I'm now going to start on the background, and I'm going to keep the background fairly simple. It is just a basic flat black. This is Carbon Black by Golden, and I'm using this straight out of the tube with a touch of water just to help with the flow. After blocking in the background, my initial step in starting any animal portrait is always to begin with the eyes. It's always nice to see the personality shining through in an animal portrait from the start, which is why I always like to start with the eyes. Here I'm using a number 2 liner brush to delicately paint around the ring of the eye, and I'm using Mars Black for this, and then I will start to block in those darker shapes in the centre of the eye. So now that I have the outline in place and those dark shapes mapped out, I'm going to start to build up the bulk of the eye colour, and for this I'm using the cadmium red light, the cadmium yellow medium, a touch of Mars Black and the burnt sienna. And I'm going to go ahead and mix these colours to get a lovely warm golden tone. So I'm going to block those colours in for the base layer of the eye and then work on building the shadows around the edge using a touch of Mars Black and burnt sienna to really bring in those dark shapes around the edges. And while the paint is wet, I will add some of those lighter tones as well, such as a touch of the buff titanium mixed in with a little bit of cadmium yellow to bring in those lighter values that we have within the eyes. So next I'm going to start to map out those shapes that surround the eye. So I'm using the Mars Black to map out the dark areas and then work on those lighter golden tones using a mixture of the colours that I've already mixed. I'm using the paint really wet here so I can blend in those colours very basically. This is just a very rough blocking in of the colours before we start to add in any further detail. And you can see here that I'm not just applying the base layers just anywhere, I'm following the general fur direction, which will help to guide me through the rest of the painting. So I'm starting the layering process now and starting to add some further depth to the fur. Here I'm using a lighter tone to bring out some of the lighter details that overlap those darker areas, and now I'm using a mix of the Carbon Black with a touch of water. It's watered down paint so I can glaze over this section of fur to help to bring out some of those darker tones. Now I'm going in with my liner brush using a light paint. This is a lighter version of the golden tone that we applied on the base layer with a touch of white titanium mixed in to make that paint lighter. And I'm going to go over this with my liner brush to really build up the detail within the fur, which will act as another layer. All these layers add up to build up the depth of the fur. So I'm going to be going backwards and forwards between lighter tones and dark tones to really build up the depth that we see within the fur, all the time using my liner brush to bring out the fineness of that fur. So the portrait of this African wild dog is quite a close-up portrait, so I really want to bring in those details to really show the intimacy of this painting. So I'm making sure that I get plenty of details down. So within this darker area here, I've applied lighter strokes to bring out those lighter, shining, reflected fur strokes, and now I'm going in with some Mars Black over the top of those to really push back those highlights, which in turn will help to bring up the depth of that black. Now I'm starting on the right side of the eye, focusing on the area around the eye, starting with Mars Black to define the darker shapes, and then using a blend of golden tones for the main fur, and then blending those together with a small mop brush. And I'm making sure my paint is really fluid, so I'm using a touch of Flow Improver by Winsor & Newton in my water just to water down a touch of the paint. This helps to bring out a soft fluidness to the paint as well as to extend the drying time, so I can really get that smooth base layer in place. So now, after adding a layer of lighter paint strokes to add to the detail and depth, I'm now going back in with a darker tone. This is the Mars Black with just a touch of water, so it's really nice and fluid, and it's slightly watered down as well, so we get a very translucent appearance. I'm just going to go around the edges of all of those dark tones and work on that transition between the dark tones and those lighter tones. So here I'm really starting to build up the layers in the fur, moving between darker tones and lighter tones. All the time my paint is slightly watered down, and I'm going between slightly richer brown tones using burnt umber and also lighter tones using burnt umber with a touch of titanium white. So I'm going between the two, adding layers of each tone, and this is really starting to build up the depth of the fur. So now I'm beginning the process of glazes. So here is a touch of yellow oxide watered down, and very gradually I'm just adding a touch of paint onto those golden tones that we see within the fur. So this will add a touch of vibrancy. And then once again going over with my liner brush and a lighter paint to really bring out those lighter fur strokes that lie right on the top of the fur. I'm now working on the central strip of fur, applying a base layer of Mars Black, using my liner brush and pulling the paint up and over into the surrounding golden fur. Next I'm following up with a layer of slightly lighter paint, burnt umber and Mars Black, mixed with a touch of titanium white and yellow oxide. And with this lighter paint I'm gently pulling the brush over that black fur right on the very edges. Starting work on the bridge of the nose, I'm starting by building up those darker shapes using a dark brown watered down, and then a lighter version of that brown for that area on top of the nose where the light hits. So I'm just blocking in the general form to begin with. So we have some beautiful blue tones that are reflecting from the sky on the bridge of the nose. So I'm using a touch of cobalt blue here to block in those blue shapes. So all of this is a base layer to blocking in the general shapes that we see on the bridge of the nose. So this is very rough and it's also watered down as well. So once I've got the general shapes and tones blocked in, I'm going in with my liner brush with a dark paint here. This is a dark brown with a touch of Mars Black, and I'm just mapping out the general fur direction of the nose here. So because the fur moves in quite a few different directions, it's important that we get that form in place. So I'm being very careful to follow the exact direction of the fur here. And here I'm just switching to a number 2 round brush so I get slightly thicker, wider paint strokes, as I want this to be more of a slightly out of focus, softer appearance to the fur strokes, so they're going to be less detailed, but I'm still blocking in the general fur direction and just almost adding detail, but it's more of a case of adding in those paint strokes to guide us through the rest of this area. So here, using a mix of raw umber and titanium white to gain a nice light brown tone, I'm going to use this colour to build up some of the details on top of the nose. So these are the lighter fur strokes and also some of the highlights as well. So I'm going to go over that previous layer that we've just applied and starting to build up those lighter layers. So while the paint is still wet before it has chance to completely dry, I'm using a small mop brush and guiding it all over the fur. I'm pushing the brush in the direction of the fur to smooth out some of those harsh edges to gain a slightly softer blurred appearance. So now that we've got a much smoother base layer, I'm adding those final details that lie on top of the bridge of the nose. I'm using both darker strokes to work in those darker fur areas and then lighter fur in the most highlighted regions of the fur, especially that central area. And for the area between the bridge of the nose and the eye, I'm just making sure that those areas are nice and bonded together just by overlapping slightly with those lighter paint strokes that overlap into that eye area. So now moving on to the actual nose itself. Here I'm mixing a touch of titanium white with cobalt blue for a nice vibrant blue tone, which is the reflected part of the nose at the top. And then for the centre part of the nose, this is just a touch of Payne's grey for a slightly darker blue. I've also mixed a touch of cobalt blue in as well to make the tone more of a blue tone than a grey tone. And then for the bottom part of the nose, this is just a touch of Mars black mixed with a touch of white for a slightly grey tone. And then just using my mop brush to blend the edges of those together. So here I'm starting to tone the nose, just a watered layer of Mars black just to darken that shadow towards the bottom of the nose. So before I begin to tone the nose further, I'm going in with my round 2 brush now and adding very gentle dabs of the brush onto the canvas using a light blue paint. So this is a touch of cobalt blue mixed with a dash of titanium white, and I'm very gently just dabbing onto the canvas to replicate that texture of the nose. So once we have these in place, this will act as a guide to the actual detail of the nose, and although it may look a little bit odd when we first apply this paint down, we can then tone the nose afterwards. Now I'm directing my attention to building up the shadows in the nose and ensuring the correct colour is in place. I'm beginning with a slightly translucent Mars black for the bottom area of the nose and then dabbing my mop brush into some dark blue paint to blend in that central area. Then I'm just going to soften off the edges of the nostrils so they're not quite so harsh. And that brings me nicely onto the next section. So here I'm using a lighter coloured paint just to very gently bring in some of that detail right on the edge of the nose where it blends into that surrounding fur. And now that I've got that nose in place, I can more easily judge the actual values of the fur surrounding the nose, so I can start to add in a few more details and lighten up some of those lighter areas. So I'm just going to block in this mouth area just very basically to start with, as I'm going to be building on this mouth more once the underlying body fur is in place. So with that being said, I'm starting to build up the surrounding fur, starting with those dark tones, building up those more prominent shapes that I see, and then slowly building up the layers of paint, going backwards and forward between the lighter tones and the dark tones, which will in turn build up the depth of the fur. And within my layers of paint, some layers are painted using my liner brush, painting in those details of long fur strokes, and then other layers I'm going to go in with my round 2 brush to add subtle glazes of burnt umber for those richer browns, and then Mars black for the darker and duller shadows. So I'm just going to leave those side areas alone for now until I've got the rest of the body fur in place. So I'm going in with some raw umber as a base layer just to cover over the white of the canvas, and then we can start to build up the fur from there. So here I'm starting to map out the general fur direction, and again this will help us to guide us through the rest of this portion of the body, so we will easily be able to find those tones once we've got the general fur direction in place. And all I'm using here is my liner brush and some Mars black paint, and I'm being quite rough with my paint strokes. It's just a very general guide as to the fur direction. So here I'm starting to add some tones to the fur, starting with a watered down black paint to bring in those darker shadows, and then for the lighter portions of the fur I'm just going in with a lighter, almost a grey tone, and then going in with my mop brush to blend those colours very gently together so we've got a smooth base to work upon. And using a lighter grey paint, I'm going back in with my liner brush to add back some of those lighter areas of the fur, this time using my liner brush to add in detail rather than just to map out the fur direction, which we've already done. So it's just a case of going over that same direction but adding to the details and adding to those lighter areas. And then I'm going to go backwards and forwards between those darker tones and bringing in the lighter tones as well. So it's just layering on top of each other and also looking at where those warmer shadows lie. So I'm going to be glazing some raw umber into the shadows, especially underneath the chin, to really bring in that warm glow, and then making sure that I overlap with those lighter tones to bring out the detail where the light hits. So I'm wanting to warm up the general tones of the body here, so I'm going in with a watered down raw umber just to add a touch of that brown warmth, and then going over once again with my liner brush with a lighter brown paint to bring back some of those highlights and those flyaway hairs that lie right on the top of the fur. So now I'm casting my eye over the whole portrait and looking at where I can add in any final details, as well as lighten up some of the highlights and also glaze in some of those darker shadows. So here I'm casting my eye over the whole body, looking at where those shadows can be darker. So I'm just glazing a layer of Mars black in those really dark shadowed areas just to make them appear a little darker. And then once I've gone over with any darkening of the shadows, I always go back and add in any highlights just to make them pop out a little further. So this clump of fur here is hitting the light very gently, so I'm making sure that I go in with my liner brush to add in those flyaway hairs, and I'm curving around my paint strokes to follow the actual contour of the fur as it curves around. And then I've just mixed a touch of raw sienna with some raw umber just to bring in a touch of that really bright golden tone just on a few areas of the fur there, and also on the mouth area. So I'm going in once again with a lighter creamy colour to add in those final details. Here I'm just adding those final touches to the mouth area and also to the muzzle just underneath the nose, making sure that I've got those tiny flyaway hairs that overlap that darker foundation. So it's important here that my paint is quite watered down, and also I'm using a really thin liner brush as well as a really soft touch, so that I don't want to muddy those paint marks. I don't want them too thick, I want them to be nice and fine. And you can see from here that I'm constantly going backwards and forwards between adding glazes and further detail, and also using a mixture of brushes as well. So I'm really bringing out those shadows, adding further tones, toning the colour, and then adding more details on top. So all of these layers add up to bring in that thickness and depth of the fur. So finally I'm on to the part of the painting that I've been really looking forward to, and that is those lovely ears. So I'm starting with a base layer, just roughly blocking in those colours, starting with the golden tones, then the brown tones, and then finally finishing off with that lighter clump of fur we have in the middle. So now I'm just making sure that the centre of the ear is dark enough before going in with my liner brush and mapping out the general fur direction using a touch of titanium white mixed with a little raw umber. So now to bring out that very soft transition of the shadow from the centre of the ear, I'm using my mop brush to very gently add a touch of watered down Mars black paint and then dabbed very gently on a paper towel to eliminate most of the pigment, so we only have a very touch of pigment on the brush. And then I'm wiping this on the canvas against the ear, that shadow, so it's a very soft transition. So now it's time for some of the lighter hairs that sit on top of the fur. So I'm just using my liner brush here with a light paint, just working on the very top parts of those hairs, and then also making sure I have the center hairs in place as well. And then I'm going over with a glaze of a dark paint to push those details back into the shadows so they don't appear quite so bright. And then once again I'm adding glazes of a golden tone and then also the dark browns as well, and then once again finishing off with those lighter hairs that sit on top. And then I'm making sure I have that dark strip in place right on the very top. So I'm making sure I go in with a dark paint. This is the Mars Black and the Raw Umber, and very gently glaze in that darker shadow, just making sure that the dark areas are nice and dark, and then also making sure that the golden tones are really golden as well. So I'm applying lighter details, which I can always add with further glazes until I get the exact colours and tone that I'm looking for. Right on top of the ear we have a little reflection, so I'm using a touch of titanium white with a little bit of cobalt blue mixed in to very gently dab the paintbrush onto the canvas. So this reflection sits slightly behind the fur, but I'm getting that in place first and then I can apply those overlapping hairs on top. And then finally, for the last little bit of this ear, I'm going to work on that fluffy section of fur that we have right in the centre there. And I'm using some watered down paint here so that the paint remains fluid and it's nice and easy to drag the paint across and form those really fine flyaway hairs, which is what I want to achieve for that centre section of fur there. And then for the second ear, I'm using pretty much the exact same process as the first ear, starting with the blocking in and then adding glazes and details. So once the ears are in place, I'm now just tidying up the edges of the forehead fur, which slightly overlaps the ear, gently pulling some subtle strokes of paint upwards and overlapping the ear area. So I'm on the final stages of finalising the portrait now. So I'm going over the whole painting as a whole, looking at where I can make any final details and any last minute adjustments. So here I'm just adding those final flyaway hairs right on the very top of the head, and these hairs here are where the light hits, so I'm just making sure that I have a slight reflection of the sky there. So I'm mixing a touch of cobalt blue with a tiny hint of Mars black as well, just to neutralize that color and mute it a little, and then applying that very gently right on the very top of the head. And then finally, for those all important whiskers, I'm applying this with a mixture of titanium white and Mars black, just to mute that white down so it's not quite so vibrant and it fits in with the overall vibe of the portrait. So I'm using my liner brush, and the paint is watered down, which makes it easier to drag that paint along and makes those whiskers more seamless and fluid when we're applying the paint. So I'm just dragging the paintbrush really gently but also quickly as well. So the quicker we do this, then the more control we have over those whiskers. And then once I finish these whiskers, I think I have a finished painting. I'm really happy with how this painting turned out, and I hope you enjoyed getting a little insight into my process of painting this African wild dog. I also hope you enjoyed my first narrated video here on YouTube. How do you prefer my videos? Do you like them narrated or set to music? Let me know in the comments below for future videos. Thank you so much for watching.